Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome as we continue along towards the end of our curriculum on wealth management. But it's been interesting times since we have jumped into the fiduciary duty section. Towards the latter part of that section, we identified how all the risk tolerances, investment strategies, investment objectives, etc., how they actually come together. And on the investment analysis side as well, we looked at when you're looking at a particular investment or a particular company, when we looked at the fundamental factors, when we looked at the technical factors, when we looked at the behavioral aspect, how all of those elements come together, there was some interesting content across there as well. So in our last session, we had already moved across into investment management. And we were spending some time with modern portfolio theory in terms of how diversification comes into play. And we saw how the systematic and unsystematic risks affect your investment, what can be diversified away and what cannot be diversified away. We looked at a more theoretical aspect in the form of the efficient frontier, where all portfolios in the respective efficient frontier are acceptable, depending on the different levels of risks that the respective investors can tolerate. The risk tolerance will decide which portfolio is more appropriate to the client given his risk tolerances. But ultimately, an important point is that all portfolios on the efficient frontier are efficient. But of course, which one you would select would depend on the investor risk tolerances. We went on to look at efficient market hypothesis as well in terms of different types of markets based on the information which is out there: a weak form market, a semi-strong form market, and a strong form market across. And we looked at the implications that this has for making exponential profits, the implications that you can make profits from technical analysis, yes or no, fundamental analysis, yes or no, insider information, and the implication it can have to the markets as well, depending on the market structure. A very interesting section thereafter, which is where we were spending time with in our last class also, capital asset pricing model. We looked at how we decide between arrive at indicative required rate of return. That is what the capital asset pricing model is about for equity holders when you look at the respective asset class. And our starting point here is we identified how, if you are looking at a risk-free asset versus a risky asset, equities, and if both are giving you the same return, where would you prefer to put your money in? Obviously the risk-free asset. And as a result, for you to attract investments into a risky security like equities, for example, you will have to offer a premium above the risk-free rate in order to do that, right? And that calculation was what we discussed on the capital asset pricing model. We extended this across to arbitrage pricing theory as well. And then we spent quite some time with the behavioral aspects of investment management as well, a very important subject from a modern business context, because most of what we study from an academic theoretical basis is looking at, okay, given the information in the markets, if you are dealing with a rational investor, how should the rational investor behave given the information structures, etc., which we have discussed. A very theoretical approach, highly reliant on a set of estimates, assumptions, etc. Behavioral finance, in contrast, tells us why an investor or a market behaved the way it did, because it is talking about behavioral aspects, right? Very interesting section. And we broke this down into several elements. The heuristics, for example, we looked at use of information, inertia, representativeness, overconfidence, anchoring, gambler's fallacy, availability. We identified what the behavioral bias is like, and as a result, what is going to be the implication to the investors as well. For example, availability is whatever comes to your mind most easily, most conveniently, you're going to give it more weight in your analytical process than anything else, right? Which may not necessarily be the correct thing. We looked at overconfidence and what does this do to you as a trader, because you have so much overconfidence, right? Unreasonable confidence on your analysis, you tend to overtrade as a result, right? And you will see these coming together in a market on a more behavioral perspective. We looked at prospect theory and some of the key concepts there in terms of loss aversion, regret aversion, mental accounting, and information and noise traders as well from a trading perspective, not an investment perspective. I believe we covered some of the equity strategies also. I think we need to go to the combining the strategies is where we stopped at in our previous session. We looked at passive strategies, buy and hold strategies, more like indexing strategies where you put your money in and you watch it grow regardless of the fluctuations over the shorter term. You're trying to replicate certain strategies, for example, the index matching strategy. You are after a very low tracking error, for example, and which will also give you a similar return as a result of that. We looked at, we have previously discussed the tracking methods as well, whether it was full replication, stratified sampling, or whether you're talking about optimization, how all of this works. And we looked at the advantages and disadvantages of the same. We are not actively trading when it comes to passive management. We'll take a few positions and we will watch the positions generate returns for us. In contrast, when you look at active investment management, you are looking at a lot more active investment approach. You are buying and selling, reconstituting, recalibrating, etc. as it applies to your asset allocation, as it applies to your sector selection, or as it applies to your security selection. Which means as a result of this active trading strategy, compared to passive trading approach in particular, you're going to be taking quite a few actions as a result, which can potentially cost you as well. Right? There'll be a transaction cost associated with it in contrast also. We looked at the top-down and the bottom-up approach to analysis or investing. And we also looked at the different, we've touched based on these value-based strategies, growth at a reasonable price strategy, momentum, contrarianist approach, and we applied these across the different investment strategies as well. Right, which brings us to our next section, which is where we called it a day in our previous class, combining active and passive management. So we've established a summary as well on how active and passive management works. Passive is kind of like a buy and hold strategy. You take positions and you watch your positions grow despite certain shorter term fluctuations. The active management, on the other hand, you're going to be taking constantly, you're moving in and out of positions to take advantages of the market situations, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that you're either an active investor or you're either a passive investor. You can have this. Investment management is about finding that balance, right? You're finding the right mix depending on tolerances, depending on investment strategies, depending on market conditions, right? You take asset classes, for example. You look at the current market conditions. Interest rates are returning you at 6-7% maybe. Investors don't want to keep their money in fixed deposits. They rather put it into the market, which is giving you a significant amount of returns, right? And if you look, the popular stock, which I keep talking about, Expolanka Holdings, right? It's hitting 120 rupees. I mean, from 1 rupee and 80 cents in March of 2020 to 120 rupees over the last couple of days. Imagine the returns. You put like 180,000 bucks down a year ago, a year plus ago. Imagine where you will be right now, right? So when you look at the different asset classes, even what happens is you might park a portion across in a cash or money market instrument or a fixed deposit for that matter, and you will use a proportion to invest across in active management, let's say in equity markets. And let's say, for example, the risk tolerance of your client is high, the capacity and willingness to take risk is high, you will skew this. You will have, let's say, 25% in the passive strategy, and you'll have about 75% across in the active strategy because it aligns with his circumstances. On the other hand, you're looking at an investor who is looking at a relatively low risk approach, but he wants some growth, some level of risk he's willing to take. Maybe 80% across into a passive approach, and 20% across into a more active approach. We will use these strategies to achieve our objectives of our investment strategy, which hopefully are aligned with the client's circumstances and objectives as well. So that is what we are after across over here. So active and passive management, as I just mentioned, is not mutually exclusive. You don't have to have one or the other. It can be combined. In fact, it will give you better execution. It will give you a better risk-return ratio. Right? It will help you to meet return objectives. It will help you to meet risk objectives. Right? Sometimes you look at only a one approach, a passive approach, for example, and if you look at an investor, it may not fit his requirement. He is looking for a relatively high level of return. Passive investment may not give that to him. He has the capacity and willingness to take some level of risk. Doesn't fit with passive investment. Then, but at the same time, he doesn't want to take a very high level of risk either, because he's not after a significant portion of return. Now you need to find a middle ground. You can't tell active management, it's not within his appetite or capacity. You can't do pure passive management purely because it doesn't fit his circumstance. You need to find the middle ground. That's where the combinations start coming together. Now, this mix itself, if we were to define it through more formally, we like to call this the co-satellite management or the co-satellite approach. Right? How do we achieve this status? For example, we put 80% across in the portfolio, which is passive. Right? So passive meaning we are not taking active positions in the market. We are not trading actively in the market. We are going to be taking a particular position and we are going to maintain that position, minimum changes. Right? So the risk of underperformance is kind of limited in a conventional market context, right? Buy and hold strategy, you will see it slowly, incrementally growing across. This is going to form our core of the portfolio, the 80%. 20% of this portfolio, on the other hand, we are going to plug across into an active investment management approach. Here we are buying and selling. We are taking trading actions and not investment approach. Trading is more shorter term oriented, can be trading on noise, for example. Here, if we are looking at a particular benchmark, we might be taking a high levels of tracking risk. We will adjust our portfolios where the compositions and where of the asset classes and where the security selections are going to be different from that of the benchmark, which will create a higher tracking error, which will create a higher tracking risk. But what are you after with this relatively higher level of risk? It is also for you to be able to achieve a higher level of return. You as the investment advisor, if you're taking a high level of risk for your client and you're giving the same level of risk, if you're giving the same level of return, then we have a problem. Then you might as well look at a passive approach. Why out of this 20% in the portfolio, are you actually taking this tracking error, this tracking risk is for the purpose of pursuing that higher level of return as well. This is that sub portion of the portfolio, we like to call it the satellite, co-satellite approach. And as you can notice, in the co-satellite approach, a greater portion is invested across in the core. That's how the combinations come together. A smart beta approach, right, combines active and passive management once again into a product to deliver on investment goals. Right? Let's see how this works. The key difference between a smart beta fund and a traditional index. Now, essentially, when you say smart beta, we are talking about combining all of these strategies into a product. Isn't it similar to an index? There are distinctions. The smart beta fund does not track market capitalization weighted indexes. Now, for example, when we looked at our passive approach, for example, we may be looking at an index replication method. But this index replication, for example, can be the from a local context, let's say the S&P SL20. From an international context, the S&P 500. What happens here is, depending on whichever the approach, we will either do a full replication or we will take a optimization approach, for example, to carry out this. But ultimately, the idea is to replicate the performance of our benchmark index. The smart beta approach doesn't actually follow any listed, our point there, does not track a market capitalization weighted index. This aspect is not the focus here. Instead, it tracks an index based on fundamental characteristics. Now the indices which you can see can be capitalization oriented, can be size oriented, can be industry oriented, blah, blah, blah. But when we look at a smart beta approach, we are going to follow indexes or indices based on fundamentals, characteristics, which can range from macroeconomic factors such as economic growth to different investment style approaches. Let's see what these are. Macroeconomic factors, for example, economic growth, inflation, interest rates, liquidities. Style factors, which we have touched based on, value driven, momentum driven, qualitative wise, size or capitalization oriented. Smart beta approach typically targets more than one factor to provide opportunity for improved returns. When you look at certain indices out there, indexes, they will either be focused on high capitalization stocks. They will either be capitalized on penny stocks, which are, high liquid stocks. So we are looking at, by and large, only one variable to drive that return for us. The smart beta approach, on the other hand, will focus on more than one factor, which will have a relatively greater opportunity to provide improved returns, to provide reduced risks. We are playing with a relatively higher number of variables here to enhance your diversification benefits. Essentially provides more opportunities relative to a conventional passive index tracking approach. By systematically tilting the investment exposures towards factors within an index framework, smart beta strategies combine characteristics of both passive and active investing. Let's say, for example, within our smart beta fund, the variables we are dealing with, let's say, are to deal with value, are to deal with growth, are to deal with size, and is to deal with liquidity. The approach will be depending on macroeconomic factors, depending on market-based factors, what the future is going to be, you will tilt your strategies. Initially, you had a market which was moving sideways, for example, and you may have to focus on more of a growth strategy, hypothetically, right? First instance, which means here you are going to take a more active approach looking at these sectors. The value, size, liquidity, etc. aspects may be a more passive focus in terms of the strategy. But as the market starts getting more active and the economy starts driving certain positives to corporates, our focus might shift to a more value-driven approach. Here, we will weight our investment exposures more towards value, and then the other variables are going to be a little more passively looked at. We won't be focusing significantly on the growth, size, and liquidity elements of it as well. You're seeing how the tilting of the fund or portfolio is achieved, and as a result, one set of variables become passive while the other variable or variables are going to be a more playing a more prominent role in your portfolio. These need to happen. You look at a financial markets perspective. Do financial markets remain constant? Are they static? Absolutely not, right? Absolutely not. You take our markets in the recent past, even pre-COVID, we had a lull. In fact, right now, during the COVID period, I mean, we were locked down for some time initially, which was not a good thing. The market was not open. But ultimately, when it opened up, I mean, we were the second best performing index in the world. We were the second best performing market in the world. Right? And you look at the turnovers now, the last couple of days, you're talking about 10 billion rupees in turnover. Right? So then if those are the situations, depending on the changes in the market conditions, you need to be able to shift your strategies as well, right? If not, you will not be making any returns. They are active that they can potentially enhance returns and reduce risk through exposure to proven drivers of return. Proven drivers of return. For example, an economic factor indicates that our foreign exchange factor, we are going to see the domestic currency depreciating, which is what we are experiencing. Domestic currency depreciating meaning, foreign currency appreciating meaning, whatever the imports are actually going to be more expensive. Take the tile sector, for example. In addition to rupee depreciating, as well as the protectionist measures, no imports of tiles are coming in. What is happening to the local manufacturers? They can't even keep up with the demand. Massive benefit. What is happening? Proven drivers of return. Let's say interest rates come down. If you look at the correlation of interest rates to capital market participation, relatively very high level of correlation. The moment interest rates come down, people start funneling money across into capital markets. The moment interest rates go up, they start moving some of their money across into capital markets. Interest rates in the US increase. Foreign funds which are invested here or anywhere in the developing nations, you will see a shift of funds across there. You're seeing how the portfolios at any given context, whether it's asset classes, whether it's securities, whether it's economies, whether it's industries, you can see how all of these can be tilted to take advantage of the market movements, right? Maybe something there. Yes, at the same time, they resemble traditional passive strategies in that their implementation is transparent, systematic, and rules-based. Within the smart beta approach as well, we will look at certain factors. We will start analyzing these variables. We will try to understand what implication it has to industries, securities, counters, etc. And there may be a time-consuming, systematic, rules-based approach. Only if the dividend yield meets a certain criteria, only if the revenue growth illustrates a certain criteria, only if the EPS growth illustrates a certain criteria, then we are going to be recommending it on a fundamental basis. You will have this systematic approach, which will be a buy and hold. It's not going to be a trading strategy. So you have the characteristics of both active and trading investment strategies in the smart beta approach. Right. We have previously, we are going to look at the role of asset classes specifically as it applies to the funds perspective. We have had an entire chapter on asset classes. We focused largely on the characteristics there. And now we are going to look at particularly from the perspective of a fund, from the perspective of a portfolio, how all of this is going to come together as well. So we are looking to understand the different asset classes within the portfolio and the use of funds as part of an investment strategy. The aim of using different asset classes is to achieve a diversified portfolio of asset classes that can enhance return while diversifying overall risk of the portfolio. Again, we come down to that same principle which we constantly keep talking about. This is the basic principle as it applies to investment management, managing the risk and return. Depending on the client's risk tolerance and objectives, you will see implications here. Depending on what you establish here, you will establish your investment strategy. And then depending on what is the status of financial markets, you will execute the respective investment strategy. Everything comes down to this fundamental of risk and return, which we are talking about, right? You're seeing it coming ahead again and again, right? How do we build this? Just let me check what is up next. No. How do we get here? I mean, do combining asset classes allow you to have a better risk return ratio? Do combining asset classes allow you to better meet your clients' requirements? Yes, they do. Yes, they do. For example, if you go and put all your money in equities, let's say, you will have a risk of hypothetically, let's say about a 20% proportion. You go and put your money in a fixed deposit or a money market instrument, let's say, your corresponding risk is about 5%. Now, if you're looking at an investor who has an average risk tolerance, right, and you want to balance this out, you can't expose him to a 20% equity risk situation. You can't expose him to only a 5% asset class situation. He's not going to make an adequate return. How do you manage this risk and return relationship? Hypothetically, right? We'll have more information to decide how we are going to go about it. 50% in equity, 50% across in fixed deposits. What is happening now? Let's put 10%. Why? 50% into the 20% risk exposure. 10% of the risk is what we are exposed to from the equity markets. 50% from the fixed deposit exposure. Only 2.5 our exposure is there. Right? Essentially, hypothetically, we are doing a 12.5% risk exposure. If you put some return numbers across in there, let's say the return on the equity portfolio was, let's say 40%, and the return on the fixed deposits were 10%. Now you can look at the risk return ratio as well. 20% into the 40%, we are talking about 2% return. Yes, unfortunately, a 2% return across here. And on the fixed deposit side of things, you're only talking about a 10% return, right? On 10%, 50%, you'll make 5%. Overall, about a 7% return versus the 12.5 risk exposure, which you may have had to income, right? Thanks to diversification, we will be able to achieve a better risk to return reward ratio as a result of that, right? We are going to see more of that as we go along as well. Just give me a second, guys, while I organize myself. So this should be constructed in consideration with the investor circumstances and objectives. This is very important, right? You look at the two extremes. If you are looking at a completely risk-averse investor, almost entirely his portfolio, if you look at our previous illustration, almost entirely his portfolio needs to be parked across into that passive fixed income portfolio, right? He doesn't want to take any risk averse. On the other hand, you have an investor who has the capacity and willingness to take risk, right? And he's going to be after return. He's telling you, I have the capacity and willingness to take risk. I want that return. That is what I'm after. You can't park significant portion of his fund across in fixed deposits. A huge significant proportion is going to be parked. 90-95% will be parked across in equities. This is what we need to balance. We will, after gathering, remember in our fiduciary duties, we spoke about collating the information and understanding the client's circumstances leading to his objective. Depending on that objective, we need to be able to decide what are the appropriate weightages that we are going to place in relation to the asset classes. The decision on how much weightage you are going to put into which asset classes is dependent on that investor's objectives, constraints, and circumstances. And if you don't have that dialogue, if you don't get that information, you are only guessing what the investor wants, which is where the conflict comes. At the end of the day, he will tell you, you know, I wanted this level of return, but this is what you're giving to me. Or, you know, you went after this asset class when I didn't have the capacity to stomach that sort of a risk. What were you thinking? That's when the problem starts coming together. So some level of some attempt has to be made to understand these circumstances and investor objectives as well. I know, easily said than done, right? All in the financial services sector. Try asking your client, what is his wealth like? What is his monthly income like? What is his monthly expenses like? I mean, he probably doesn't know what it is. He's just guessing and putting in there. You're asking about his liquidity constraints over the next 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, 1 year, and 2 years, and 3 years. What are his expected significant outflows? He'll look at you like you're crazy, right? But if we can't identify them, at least to some minimal extent, it's going to be difficult for us to structure a suitable portfolio. Some attempt needs to be made there. Different asset classes and their use in investing. How do you see all of these coming together? Right now, we've seen this to a great extent, because all of these users are driven by the characteristics of the asset class. Think about cash. Remember when we were talking about cash under asset classes? Low risk, high liquidity. As a result of the low risk, based on our relationship of risk and return, what is that also telling us? Relative return is also going to be low. Bonds, some level of risk increases. Credit risk, interest rate risk, issuer related risk, etc. There is some level of risk relative to cash. Steady and stable income in the form of current income. Interest rate risk, major implication. We know the duration, the interest rate changes and the implication on the price of the bond to a substantial 90% plus is the variation there is explained by interest rate fluctuation. Right? Different credit levels from issuers, for example, the different levels of credit quality can also raise question marks in terms of the risk to the respective asset class. Relative risk is a little high. At the same time, the relative return is also going to increase. Then comes the alternatives. Right? Helps moderate overall portfolio risk and different return profiles from traditional asset classes. And can be transparent. Alternatives we can talk about, for example, let's move to the likes of property, for instance, to commercial property investing, or residential property investing, etc. Has entirely different characteristics. Fairly secure. Doesn't give you much in terms of a current income. You'll get the current income, but it will go to maintaining the property. A greater proportion of the return is going to come from capital appreciation. But at the end of the day, you have a tangible asset behind you as well. Right? If you want to, you can build a shed and go and live there. You go and put your money in equities and you lose the money, you have nothing tangible. Right? You're out on the streets. And ultimately comes the stocks and shares. High growth, capital is also at risk. Now, this is a summary of what we've seen in terms of the asset classes, but you can understand, you need to appreciate how much of time we spent there in terms of understanding the characteristics of the asset classes, what drive the characteristics of asset classes, which is set to give us a good understanding. Okay, how does each of these asset classes fit into the portfolio of my client, depending on his objectives and constraints, etc. Right? Which we are about to see more. Example. Right, this was the illustration I was telling you earlier as well. 100% invested across in an equity portfolio with, let's say, a standard deviation of about 60%, for example. You're talking about an overall risk of 60% as it applies to the entire 60% is relevant to your entire portfolio because you put it entirely in equities. Same portfolio, on the other hand, instead of having 100% in equities, you put 50% into equities and you go and put the other 50% across in a money market instrument with a 5% standard deviation. Now what is going to happen? You will have only 30% exposure from a risk perspective on the equity portfolio, you'll only have 2.5% exposure from the money market instrument exposure. What is also going to happen to your return? It's going to come down. Higher the risk, higher the return. Lower the risk, lower the return. But much better balance in terms of a risk-return relationship, right? Which type of client are you going to advise to put all of his money, all of his wealth into equity markets? I don't think any client you can give that exposure, give that advice. All his wealth. I'm saying fixed deposits, properties, whatever the monies he have, you're telling him to go and put it in equities. That is not, I don't think there is any type of client out there who would be willing to put his money across in that. One portion, only a portion of the wealth, overall wealth of the investor, you will recommend to invest in equity as an asset class, depending on the circumstances. So essentially, 15 to 30%, 15 to 5%. Your weighted average risk exposure at the end of the day is only 32.5%. This is how we will use the different asset classes in order for us to achieve our required levels of risks, depending on client objectives and circumstances. Right, let's look at how these asset classes in a little more detail fit our portfolios. The role of cash in a portfolio, highly liquid, right? And at any given time, you can withdraw it across and you can use it for the purpose of your consumption. Very simple. Right? If at all, a risk might lie in terms of your purchasing power coming down, right? But ultimately, low risk, particularly on a relative basis, which also means you holding on to cash. What does this mean? You're parking it in a savings account. You will get minimal return. You're keeping it under your mattress. You won't get any return. Right? So relative level of, you have to take risk for you to make return. And if the level of risk is ultimately very low, the return is also going to be very low. Right? Which is why you can't tell your investors, for security purposes, we are holding your cash in our a greater proportion of cash in your funds. The more cash you hold, the greater the drag that cash is going to have on your overall return, because it's not generating good levels of return, right? So we need to balance this across. Valuable tool in terms of controlling the volatility in the portfolio. You saw in our previous illustration how, as a result of putting money across into the money market instrument, how we brought our exposure from 100% down to a weighted average 32%, 32.5%, right? We can use cash and money markets for this purpose, to control that volatility. If we are looking at a significantly risky position, let's say in a derivative position, which is going to have an impact on a notable proportion of our portfolio, we can focus on that risk and return aspect, but we need to be able to offset it across to some extent by investing in a different asset class. Property, but not very liquid. Cash, liquid, but not generating much return. But ultimate objective is to balance the risk return, ultimately giving you a good ratio, right? Risk to return ratio. Suited as a long-term investment as historically an underperforming asset class. It's better to put your money in a fixed deposit. You will earn more than holding cash. It's better to put your money in an equity portfolio, although the higher risk, but it has been a better investment income in contrast to holding cash. I mean, that's a basic discussion there, right? If you hold cash, low risk, but at the same time, the return is going to be very low, underperforming asset class, historically. So if you have as an asset manager, as a fund manager, if a greater proportion of your funds are invested, are held in cash, when it comes to benchmarking your performance versus that of your peers, you're going to be in a worse off position. The role of bonds in a portfolio thereafter. You go and park your funds money in a set of bonds or in a bond, right? What is going to happen? You're going to have current income. That is a predictable aspect of it. a certain aspect of it to a great extent unless there is a credit event. And you know there is a predictable stream of cash flows that is going to come to you in the form of interest across the respective tenor and the principals at the end of the tenor. Is there some risk associated with investing in bonds? Yes. Price will fluctuate depending on prevailing interest rates. Credit risks of the issuers can be there in place, right? There can be risks which can affect the industry where you put your bonds in, which can affect the credit quality of it. Range of income yields to suit different investment and tax considerations. You can find a range of yields for bonds, no problem at all. One bond will give you 10%, another bond will give you 18%. Right? So if you are a rational investor, you would rather go and put your money in the 18%. But you have to understand that same risk return relationships are going to prevail. Why do you think one bond is giving 10% and the other bond is giving you 18%? Because bond B must be having some relatively higher risk attached to that issue or issuer. Credit quality of the issuer is not good. Historically, he has some issues attached to it. The collateral is not adequate to cover the values, etc. Or he is in an industry which is extremely competitive and the return and the growth are going to be a difficult aspect, which is why to compensate for that higher risk, bond B is offering you a high level of return. You have to bear this in mind. And of course, interest is always a tax deductible caption, which gives us the tax shield effect and is another consideration as it applies to investments in bonds. Inflation, as we have already discussed, can play a major role in terms of investing in bonds. Why? You are only going to get a fixed level of return. You invested in $1,000 bond face value, which tells you you're going to receive a 10% coupon every 6 months. So you will have $50 coming to you in 6 months time, and you'll have another $50 coming to you in 6 months time, $100, which is 10% of the face value of $1,000. Very simple. But the issue here is you're having a fixed return, fixed income. If interest rates are on the rise in the market and your return, your income is going to be a static, technically your purchasing power is coming down, which is, to some extent what you're seeing in a current context here, right? Not that the salaries are increasing, but the prices of goods are going up. And it will have a knock-on effect. Consumption, disposable income, industries affected, etc. This will continue to happen. This is, of course, this purchasing power being affected is, of course, unless the bonds are inflation-linked bonds. If that is the case, inflation-linked bonds, the returns are going to be compensated for that drop in the purchasing power as well. Then you don't have that same element across. Default risk, the credit aspect is a major consideration, and there are some additional risks of holding the bonds which we have not touched based on, which we have delved into under bonds. Credit risk is one of the major aspects which we will have to talk about. The market or the price risk, which I explained duration, the sensitivity of the price of the bond to changes in interest rates has a major implication to the price of the bonds. Unanticipated inflationary risks, which can affect the real value of your holding. Liquidity risk for some bonds that are not traded regularly. You can get in, get out and trade bonds as well. But if the liquidity doesn't prevail, you're not going to be able to do that. And if you're talking about bonds in an international context, you are going to see the exchange rate risk aspect coming into play as well. Which, for example, the Sri Lankan market has a major challenge. If we try to attract foreign investors and they ask you what is the return we are giving, they'll sometimes laugh us off, right? We'll tell them, hey, look here, we are willing to give you 15%, 20% return on capital markets, for example. When, your markets are only offering you 0.25% on interest and your capital markets are only giving you 10%, but he's laughing at us. Why? The question he's going to ask is, what is your inflation rate? What is your foreign currency depreciation return? The percentage. You put all of this together, he will tell you, you need to offer me about 60% before I can come into the market. And you're telling me I'll give you 20%. Can have major implications from a foreign investor perspective as well. We also looked at call options attached to bonds as well, where you have an early redemption risk if the issuer has the right to call the bond prior to its expiration. Seniority risk, effect of seniority in the event of liquidation. There are different bond classes, and some bond classes will have priority over the other in the event of a liquidation, meaning they'll get paid first, the senior classes or the senior tranches, as we like to call it, right? And then if you're the non-priority or the non-senior tranche, you will be the last to be paid, right? Which is also a risk for you. Bond strategies, we don't dive into any fixed income strategies here, just scratching the surface. Diversification within bond issues will also be important to reduce the risk of the portfolio. Now, see, from an overall perspective, if you look at your situations, we look at the overall wealth of our client. Overall wealth of the client. We identify, okay, let's park into fixed deposit as one asset classes. We look at money market instruments. We will look at a separate fixed income market. We will look at a property investments. We will look at equities. These are the proportions of the wealth, how we are managing. Within, since our discussions are on fixed income, within fixed income, we will, for example, put our money in treasury bonds. We will put our money in debentures, etc. And whatever the money which we put in here as well, we need to think about it. Are we going to put all our money across into one industry or one issuer? No. This is going to be putting our investment at risk, right? We can't afford to do that. Therefore, what are we going to be going after? We are, even within the respective fixed income portfolio, we need to think about debentures invested across, for example, in the manufacturing sector. Debentures invested across in the automobile sector. Debentures invested across in the healthcare sector. Look at the amount of diversifications which you can achieve. From the wealth down to the asset classes. Within the asset classes, you also have subclasses which you can diversify into. And within those subclasses, you also have security selection which you can go across. This is what we are after. This is what we want to do to enhance our risk to reward ratio. The volatilities in our portfolio are going to come down. Why is that? It is very rare, unless you are talking about a systematic risk component, a market risk component, but it is very rare that one variable can affect all of this. If we've achieved a reasonably good diversification level in our portfolio, one variable affecting multiples of these is going to be very rare, unless, like I mentioned, it's a systematic or a market specific factor. Very rare that one variable will affect all across the board. This is what we are after. Then, even if one variable goes out, exchange rate is depreciating, no problem. One section of our investment is going to be affected, but is it material? No. We have put 20% of our investment in fixed income. Out of that, 50% across in debentures. Within that, only 10% across is in the manufacturing sector. 20% into 50% into 10%, you're looking at 0.1%, if I'm not mistaken. 1%, yeah, 0.1% is going to be your exposure. Are you going to see significant volatilities happening in your portfolio? No. Your portfolio values, there will be minimal volatility. And minimal volatility meaning what? At the end of the day, the envisioned risk return ratio you're going to achieve. What was the risk that you were forecasting? Let's say we wanted a 12% level of risk and we wanted a return level of, let's say, 24%. This is what we were after. And if this is going to be our situation, this client objectives which we have established at the onset, now we are on target to achieve. This is what we are after. And the structures which are at our disposal is pretty much unlimited, isn't it? I mean, of course, from a local context, things can most definitely improve in terms of asset classes, alternative investments, and otherwise, no doubt. But ultimately, we can achieve similar outcomes with different structures. Right? No problems at all. This is what we are after. And this is what we meant by diversification within the bond issues are also important. And you're seeing the implications it can have from an overall portfolio perspective as well. Portfolio of several bonds of different types and spread across different issuers. You don't want to get caught into one issuer as well. What do you mean by that? You go and put your money across different debentures, manufacturing, automobile, healthcare. But all of those debentures are coming under one investment company. You take some of the big conglomerates out there, the likes of LOLC, the likes of John Keel's Holdings, the likes of Hemas, although not a big the likes of Aitken Spence, for example. I mean, you're talking about hundreds of companies out there sometimes. The last thing you want to have is you have different industry exposures, but the issuer is the same guy, all John Keels, all Aitken Spence. That is not what you want to happen as well, because the performance of the issuer is going to have a bearing on your bond as well. The credit quality, the collateral, the profitability, the cash flow collections, these are all centered around that single issuer. If you have put all your money, despite being across different sectors, it's the same issuer. You don't want that to happen either, right? The construction of a bond portfolio should look to ensure that there is an appropriate balance between investment grade and high yielding bonds. Now, hopefully you will remember that we have discussed on investment grade versus high yielding bonds as well, right? What do we mean by investment grade bonds? And what do we mean by high yielding bonds, which we talk about here? When we say investment grade, what we are saying is the credit quality is very high, meaning the credit risk at the same time is going to be relatively lower. High yield bonds, just as the name suggests, they are offering you a relatively high level of return. But why are they offering you that relatively high level of return? Because there is a high level of risk attached to it. To compensate for that incremental level of risk, that high yield is offered. Remember, what is the alternative name for these high yield bonds, which they are called? They are also called junk bonds. Right. A bit of a harsh word, but it is what it is. We need to have the portfolio should have an appropriate, very important, should have an appropriate balance between here, because credit quality high, credit risk low, meaning what is going to be the implication to the return? Relatively low. If you put most of our investments across here, the subsequent return, despite the risk being low, is going to be lower. High yield bonds, high return to compensate for that higher level of risk. Now we need to use this high risk, I beg your pardon, high return and low return aspect, and we need to weight our portfolios appropriately to generate an adequate level of risk to reward ratio. That is what we are after here. We want a high level of return, but at the same time, we need to, through diversification, achieve a desired level of risk in pursuit of that return. This is where we will balance this weightage in our portfolios to try and achieve that objective. So we should have an appropriate balance between investment grade and high yield bonds, as well as between government and corporate issuers. Same argument exists, guys, right? When we say a government issuer, the credit risk is technically going to be relatively very low. Government issuer, they'll print money even and give you. If you look at a corporate issue, on the other hand, he obviously doesn't have the capability to issue money and give it to you. His performance or his ability to pay is going to be directly related to the company's performance. And there are many variables affecting that: industry factors, economic factors, company specific factors, market related factors, etc., which can put the credit risk of a corporate issuer, this can be relatively higher. So if we only focus on risk and go with the government issue, what is going to happen to our return in the portfolio is also going to be relatively low. If we only focus on the corporate issuer, who will give you a higher level of return, but it is going to come with a higher level of risk. We need to balance this across the system. Look at how important that risk return discussion constantly is as it applies to investment management. And if you can apply this most effectively, the outcome of your advice is also going to be very, very high level. The diversification in a bond portfolio, therefore, is going to consist of all which we have already discussed, right? Bonds from different issuers, because we want to protect ourselves against issuers' default risk. Like the John Keel's Aitken Spence example, for instance. Bonds of different types across government institutions, international agencies, corporates, etc. We want to spread our exposure here as well, right? Which helps us to protect our exposure against a particular sector. Now, if one variable affecting a particular sector materializes, not necessarily is it going to affect your material portion of your portfolio. Right? Bonds of different maturities. Although that discussion, we don't go into the depth of it, generally longer term bonds with higher tenors tend to be more sensitive to interest rate movements. Let's say, for example, you have a 3-year bond and you have a 7-year bond, right? And we are talking about a 1% change in interest rates. The sensitivity or the price movement in the bond here, let's say interest rates increase, and we have established there is a converse relationship between interest rates and the price yield of the bonds. 1% interest rate increase, you will see the 3-year bond moving by, let's say, 2%, hypothetical. But the 7-year bond might actually experience a movement by about 5%. Tenor, higher the tenor, greater the sensitivity to interest rate movements also, right? The detail is not part of our curriculum. Strategies. Laddering or immunization. Okay, so what we'll do is maybe let's go into our break. This is a little technical, which I think is good if we can look at a bit freshly, right? So we'll come back to discuss on the strategies. Any questions, guys? I can help you out with any questions that you want to respond to. Hopefully, no meetings in progress or whatever. If you've got anything, feel free to put it up on the portal, on the chat box. As soon as we get back in, we'll start with responding to it. Right? So I shall see you in about 20 minutes.